Welcome to the Nick Hilera Show. This is the place where we explore big ideas with people having a big impact on our world. I'm your host, Nick Hilera, serial entrepreneur, author, early morning riser, and seeker of truth and wisdom. Join me as we explore the journeys and discoveries of fascinating people who are literally unlocking the secrets to creating a life of both success and fulfillment. Each episode will arm you with insights, ideas, and practical perspectives on what it takes not only to be financially and personally successful, but also how to start having authentic impact on the world around you. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Nick Hilera Show. Believe it or not, this week we are welcoming yet another old law school friend of mine to the show, Raul Torrez. Raul is the current Attorney General for the state of New Mexico and a rising star in the Democratic Party. A former district attorney and White House fellow during the Obama administration, Raul is someone who has completely dedicated his life to public service. As you all know, we are living in extremely interesting and consequential times when it comes to the constitutional legal landscape. It seems like almost every week, another new long-standing precedent is up for grabs. We've seen an increasingly active Supreme Court rule on big issues like abortion, affirmative action, voting rights, and free speech. I wanted to have Raul on the show to get his perspective because he's someone who engages with these ideas day in and day out at the highest possible level. In this important, timely conversation, we discuss big issues like criminal justice reform, immigration policy, and voting rights, and examine the legal, political, and constitutional contours of the big debates of the day. We also discuss what it's like to be a prosecutor and attorney general, and examine the critical role that these offices play in our democracy. This is an episode that is full of insight and ideas, so I encourage you all to pay close attention. Raul shares some pretty powerful counter-narrative ideas when it comes to issues like criminal justice reform, prosecutorial discretion, and the role that law can play in shaping American society. As always, thanks for tuning in and hope you enjoy. Welcome to the show, man. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
There are so many topics I want to cover, and I know we have a limited time because we live in this seemingly crazy and unusual time where these massive public policy issues are being decided on in the courts. And so I want to spend a lot of this conversation kind of picking your brain about your perspective on these issues. But I thought we would start with something that's sort of top of mind across the country today, which is the most recent indictment of former President Trump. Just wanted to maybe not get into the politics of it, but get your perspective as a former prosecutor about the situation. So what do you think's going on there?
Because I'm a former prosecutor, I take the time to kind of dig in to a little bit more in the details. I read sort of briefly the indictment, and I have to say sort of at the outset that this is one of the most meticulous indictments that I've ever seen. I've handled hundreds of cases in both state and federal court, and a lot of times when we put charging documents together, we don't include that level of detail in terms of setting out what the government's case is going to be. But Jack Smith is the consummate professional, had a pretty stellar career as leading the public integrity section, then working on the War Crimes Tribunal. So it's not unexpected that somebody of his caliber would put this together, especially given the extraordinary political stakes. At first glance, I would say that if it were any other defendant, some of the commentary I've seen is that they would be very quickly reaching out to DOJ, trying to figure out a way to negotiate a plea agreement because the evidence is pretty clear and pretty damning. One complicating factor in that is his pretty heavy reliance on the crime fraud exception. They had a judge in D.C. rule that the communications between the former president and his attorney was going to form the basis of some of the evidence that was presented to the grand jury. I expect that's going to be the subject of a motion, and that's going to be heavily litigated in pretrial. But if that evidence is allowed to be presented to a jury, he's going to have a very difficult time making his case. But of course, this isn't just about the law. It's about this particular defendant, right? It's the first time a former president's been indicted in federal court. And so a lot of this, or most of this, quite frankly, is going to be filtered through politics. And the concern that I have as a prosecutor has less to do with what happens in the courtroom, because I think that can be assuming the judge handles it in the normal course of, or treats it the same way that you would expect a similarly situated defendant to be treated in that context. it's not so much what happens inside the courtroom, it's what happens outside the courtroom. What happens if he's convicted? What are his core supporters going to do in response? We already had, I think, unfortunately, the January 6th events sort of showed us what people are willing to do when they think he's under attack or they respond to some sort of call to action that he issues. And that was just in response to losing elections. So what will be the call to action if he's convicted and he's actually looking at years in federal prison? So that's deeply concerning, I think, and it should be deeply concerning to everyone. It's not a reason not to move forward with the case, but I think everyone should be mindful of that. And then on the other side, what happens if he goes to trial and he's acquitted? There's going to be a pretty sharp response to that. I would imagine that the special prosecutor's task is, and it should be his task, is just to look at the facts, apply the law to the facts, and make a professional decision about whether or not he can meet his burden. For the rest of us, I think we have to be mindful of the political consequences, but more broadly, the institutional consequences about everyone's faith in the justice system, in the judicial process, in the political process. And we have to be prepared to sort of navigate that. And what that's going to require is a lot of statesmanship on both sides of the equation, right? Democrats in how they respond to it, and responsible Republicans in how they respond to it, and how we kind of hopefully can navigate what I think are pretty turbulent waters that lie ahead of us.
Yeah, it seems like an incredibly risky time for many reasons. Putting aside, let's assume that this isn't former President Trump. How long does a case like this take to go to actual trial and have a jury, decide normally? I guess this isn't a normal case, so you can't really say that, but what should it take to resolve?
My frame of reference is skewed because most of what I did was related to narcotics trafficking and violent crime on the border and things like that. So it's a different timeline, different time scale. I would imagine that in a normal circumstance, let's say it was just a low-level government employee who was found to be in possession of classified materials, and you had the same basic evidence, I would imagine that case could be effectively navigate the pretrial phase and present it to a jury within a year or year and a half. And what I think is really critically important is what the strategy each side is going to employ in terms of setting the pace, not just the substance, but trying to dictate the calendar and dictate the pace. All outside observers, as far as I can tell, have sort of indicated that the Department of Justice's plan is to move as quickly as possible, and that the defense strategy is to try to drag this out and try to delay this as far as they can. But I think I would think it would be unlikely that this would be presented to a jury before the presidential election. I just think, given the complexity of the issues that are involved, the nature of who he is as a defendant, and the fact that the judge is going to want to really vet all of these arguments, they are going to, and I would think the judge is going to want to give the defense as much time as possible to prepare for each of these sort of complex legal issues that need to be addressed. And so we may find ourselves in a situation where this criminal matter is not resolved by the time the election happens. And so you could literally have somebody, if Donald Trump is reelected, he would be the president-elect and also simultaneously facing a federal criminal indictment and preparing for trial. And then we get into a whole new sort of complex realm of hypotheticals, because can he just wait, go to trial, even if he's convicted, and then pardon himself? I don't know. It seems to me like he might be able to use that power to pardon himself. But then again, this is obviously a question that's never been addressed or examined carefully on a constitutional basis. So who really knows at this point? We're so far into sort of uncharted waters that we're going to be sort of figuring this out as we go, because there's literally no handbook for this anywhere. I can guarantee you, inside the Department of Justice and anything that we learned in law school, we're in a space where I don't think anyone ever really envisioned this scenario happening in this way. And frankly, that's the shame in how this thing unfolded, because frankly, I think that former President Trump's big mistake was not only in maintaining the classified documents, but in obstructing the investigation, right? I think there was a moment for him to take an off-ramp when the FBI and the National Archives started reaching out and saying, we think you have these documents in your possession. Former Vice President Mike Pence, President Biden, others have been found in possession of classified documents, maybe knowingly or unknowingly. And the normal course of action is to say, oh, I'm sorry, absolutely, come in, take whatever you need, right? Come in and catalog what you need. There was a decision that was made, I guess, on the advice of his legal team to try and fight and sort of slow things down and resist this. And it's exactly that sort of resistance to recovering the materials that, frankly, I think led to the indictment. It makes the indictment that much worse and the evidence against him that much stronger because it exhibits a knowledge, number one, that he knew these documents were in his possession. He knew these documents were classified. And then he's having discussions about hiding the documents or denying that they even exist. And had they taken a totally different approach and just said, yes, come on in, here they are, it's easier for him at that point to say, well, these are accidentally retained or these are things that I didn't know what classification level. You wouldn't have had any of that evidence against him. And so it was the fighting of the recovery of the documents itself that kind of led, I think, inevitably to this conclusion.
Yeah, it's like the classic case where the cover up is worse. Yeah. Speaking of law school, one of the few things I do remember from law school, remember Professor Grunfest? Mm-hmm. He taught capital markets, great teacher, one of the best teachers at Stanford Law School. He would always talk about this idea that prosecutorial discretion is like this superpower of our system that most American citizens don't really think about. It's maybe top of mind today for people because they're understanding the unique role that prosecutors play in making these decisions. But this case is an incredible example of how consequential that power can be. And you spent, the greater part of a decade or so as a prosecutor yourself. How do you think about prosecutorial discretion? What are some of the lessons you learned making those decisions about who to go after and who not to?
That's a great question, in part because I think it's one of the biggest missing elements in terms of what we teach in the legal academy. Most of the time that we spent in law school was dedicated to understanding the rules of evidence, how to make objections, how to make a presentation to a jury or argue your point to the judge. But what they don't tell you is how to resolve cases in a way that are in line with community norms and values and really sort of reflect what the best possible outcome is for society. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have a 25 or 26-year-old defendant who has some criminal history, but not a massive amount of criminal history. And whether it's in the federal system or the state system, you're looking at a history of drugs, you're looking at a history of prior criminal acts, and let's say they have a gun. The question for someone like me, assuming I can make my case and prove my case, how long should this person spend in prison? The way they teach it to us in law school is, well, that's a decision for the judge. Your only job is to make the case and leave it to the judge. In reality, something like 90% of our criminal cases and closer to 95% of federal criminal cases are resolved by plea agreement, which means it's up to the prosecutor in negotiating with defense counsel to set the framework for punishment and incarceration. I have no idea, because I was never trained, to think about what would be both beneficial from an individual standpoint and from a community standpoint in terms of trying to maximize the utility of the criminal justice system with regard to punishing this specific defendant. In other words, what if I have data that shows me that the recidivism rate for this particular defendant with these characteristics, it goes up, right, rather than down if my rate of incarceration exceeds 5 years. But I also know that if I undershoot the mark by a couple of years, that I don't sort of hit that sweet spot of changing human behavior. We don't think about it that way. What we think about is what feels right. And this is the part where prosecutors don't really like to talk about it. It's all cloaked in prosecutorial discretion, but you get a sense of what feels right. The problem with that is it leads to too much variability in the criminal justice system. I don't know what my colleagues next door or across the hall are doing with regard to that same defendant. I don't even know if I'm being internally consistent with myself. In other words, I could be a young prosecutor who is eager to try this particular case, which means I will offer a very punitive plea agreement to try and force the issue because I'm trying to prove that I can take this case to trial. And 10 or 15 years later, I've done that trial 100 times. I've seen 100 of these defendants, and here's the standard 3-year offer. In other words, because we don't use data inside the criminal justice system, and that's the key. From my perspective. We need to demystify the legal profession, and we need to demystify the criminal justice system. We need to start layering data into this, and that was one of the things that I was really trying to push inside my office as district attorney is, do you even know if the offer that you're making or the outcome that you're driving towards is in alignment with the people in your building? Do you know that you are being consistent with your own standards from 5 years ago, or do you have a sense of what your standards are going to be 5 years from now? Think about medicine, right? When you go to the doctor and you're trying to deal with get a professional assessment about a course of treatment and how you're supposed to deal with something that's complex, you would expect that research and professional practice would lead to a standard of care that is bounded by data in the medical profession that says, okay, with these symptoms, we should probably start with this type of medication before we move to a surgical option or something like that. In the legal profession, a lot of it is like throwing darts at a dartboard. So depending on what prosecutor you get when you come into the system, that prosecutor could say, crack his chest open, we're doing open heart surgery. And a different prosecutor says, no, give him a Tylenol and send him home. It's probably something that can resolve. I know that's not a perfect analogy, but we do ourselves a disservice in the legal profession by trying to separate the decision-making process and cloak the decision-making process and saying to the rest of society, well, you didn't go to law school, so you don't really understand how we reach these decisions. But the truth is, they don't teach us that in law school. They don't teach me what the right kind of resolution should be. And then if you take a step back from the individual perspective and you look at the community perspective, if my goal is to maximize overall community safety, shouldn't I have a deeper understanding of exactly that inflection point where the recidivism rate for a particular defendant with a particular criminal history charged with a particular offense, you should set the punishment at this level? I think we need to do a whole lot more to start extrapolating data and using data as not as an overriding sort of consideration, but you should at least be aware of the fact that there's too much variability. And that's just from the prosecutor's perspective. Once you start adding in the police officer who often refers the case to us, maybe they charge at a higher level or a lower level. And then on the other side, you have a judge. So if you think about all these different inputs, you have a cop who makes a decision, a prosecutor who makes a decision, and a judge who makes a decision. You can end up with these wildly varied outcomes in the system. And it's that variability in the system that leads people to believe that it's not grounded in equal treatment for similarly situated defendants. It's, again, alchemy. And we have to get out of the business in this country, especially in the legal system, of performing acts of alchemy that we can't justify to other community members.
Hey guys, this is Nick. I wanted to take a quick break from the episode to share some exciting news. In addition to the podcast, I want to make you aware of some additional content we're putting out. And best of all, it's 100% free. Our Profit Plus newsletter consists of weekly insights about what it takes to find meaning in the pursuit of modern success. This is the place where we explore big ideas at the intersection of markets, business, politics, and life as we seek to empower our readers to have an authentic impact on the world. If you're serious about finding fulfillment amid success, then definitely check out these additional insights. Just go to subscribe.nickhilaris.com. Again, that's subscribe.nickhilaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, what you just described there is how you get a world where, if you look at incarceration rates for minorities, for example, they're like way higher relative to their population size. You throw systemic racism at the system that is operating the way you just described it, and for 30, 40 years or more, and then bam, that's what you get, a crazy prison population that doesn't really reflect the truth.
I've been sort of at the center of those debates and have been accused. It's interesting in the role that you play, being a prosecutor for a very long time. And my father's a career prosecutor, or was. He recently retired. It was this sort of role that was a critical role that was played in society and in every community, but it was somewhat hidden and somewhat shielded from a lot of scrutiny. I think it's a good thing that we have a lot more sunshine on what it means to be a prosecutor, but I also think it's hard for people to understand the underlying dynamics that drive some of these outcomes. And what I mean by that is it is absolutely true that we have an overrepresentation of communities of color inside the criminal justice system, inside prisons, and there are very specific policy decisions both at the state and federal level that reinforced that trend and magnified and amplified that. And I think it is undeniably true that there is systemic racism, and there has been in our criminal justice system since the founding of the Republic. But what I will also say, and this is the part that's probably more difficult for some of my friends and peers to hear and comprehend, is that there are other dynamics that also reinforce and amplify that overrepresentation that are not necessarily driven by systemic racism, or I guess it depends on how you would define it. But one of the things that I have noticed, and one of the things that I've really tried to focus in on, is the origins of crime and criminal activity in families and then in communities. And from my perspective, when I get asked, probably the most common question I get asked is, well, what's driving the crime problem in Albuquerque or in New Mexico? Is it guns? Is it drugs? Is it gangs? Things like that. My perspective is that is at its root, the root cause of most of the crime issues that we see, it can be traced to early childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. 75% of the boys, 87% of the girls in juvenile custody in Bernalillo County when I was DA had 5 or more ACEs. That means they had been the victims of sexual assault, they had witnessed abuse, they had lived in the home of an addicted parent, and unfortunately, the concentration of ACEs is highly correlated with communities that lack resources, access to education, access to rehabilitation, healthcare, a whole different sort of variety of things. But family instability is something that leads to a lot of these issues. And we have a situation where, and most prosecutors don't really like to get into this, but when we do our jobs, we actually create ACEs. We actually create trauma in a community. Meaning, when I was the district attorney, every single day of the week, we would send somebody's parent to prison. And when we sent someone's parent to prison, we destabilized that child's life, right? That 3 or 4 or 5-year-old child's life. And if their mom is not in a position, let's say, to care for them because she's also suffering from an addiction issue, then the role of stepping in to stabilize that child usually falls to a grandparent or an aunt or somebody who tries to step in, but they often don't have the same resources to make sure that child's okay. And then you've set that child on a path that is much more likely to lead them towards prison, frankly, than they are to college. In other words, I've in all my time as a state and federal prosecutor and all the times I've sent people to prison, when I get a pre-sentence report, which is like a biography of a criminal defendant's life before I've encountered them, it almost always starts with a litany of abuse, neglect, and exposure to addiction from 0 to 5. And it's society's failure to intervene at that level. What happens is that kid starts to struggle in school. They fall behind. Maybe they're acting out. They're acting up. It's not surprising. They end up getting suspended or expelled at higher levels. Then they go out on the streets, and guess who they find on the streets? They find other kids like themselves Then they try to replicate the family that they don't have at home with the people they met at the street, except the family you find on the street, they need you to earn your keep. So then you start dealing. And by the way, you're traumatized. So you're not only dealing, you're probably using. Then you get ripped off on the street. And when you get ripped off, you pick up a gun, right? So you're seeing this sort of escalating pattern of behavior. And one thing leads to another. And you cross into adulthood, you get arrested, you find yourself in front of somebody like me inside a court. And my options at that point are extremely limited. And that cycle that I have just described, all of that precedes the encounter with law enforcement, the encounter with a prosecutor. In other words, the prevalence of ACEs in impoverished communities of color drives an extraordinarily high rate of the behavior that we see bringing them into contact with an officer who, or a system that may, even without any inherent bias in it, is just going to get an overrepresented sample of a community that is suffering from all of those social inputs. And the reality is, my job as a prosecutor, especially when you cross into the realm of committing violent crime, I have limited options. But from my perspective, if you brandish a weapon and you threaten a member of your community, I have an obligation to try and to make sure that the community is safe. And if that means removing you from the community, then my option is to send you to prison. Well, what that really means is I've sent you to graduate school for criminals. I'm now going to take an addicted, traumatized young person who has no family stability and no community support, and I'm going to pin them up. I'm going to surround them with other people just like that. Most of them are going to come back to the community without having their addiction treated, without having their trauma recognized, without having any of that recognized. We'll drop them back into the community, and the cycle just repeats itself. It's rinse, wash, repeat. That's what we do. But there's another important dynamic in all of this, and this is where I struggle with people who sometimes really get centered on how we need to totally restructure the criminal justice system because of its impact on communities of color. And what I would often remind them, because people don't seem to understand or don't want to recognize it, is they not only make up the lion's share of people who are incarcerated, they make up the lion's share of the people who are victimized, right? So what I have found is that a lot of working class communities of color who are suffering from extraordinarily high levels of violence, they don't want less police, right? They don't want fewer cops around. They want more cops around. Now, they want cops who are properly trained. They know how to de-escalate. They're in a protective, they are sort of oriented around a guardianship idea rather than a warrior idea where we're trying to sort of keep this community down. A properly trained police officer in that context understands that they have a role to play in trying to mitigate harm and all those other things. But undeniably, what I can tell you is that the closer you are to poverty and trauma at the levels that we see in those communities, the more they want energized and active, but competent and balanced law enforcement. It tends to be people who are further removed from those communities who are the most ardent in making the arguments about, oh, this is all systemic racism. When you live in a really nice part of town and you have all kinds of resources and crime is theoretical to you, right? It's easy to look at the system and say, well, it must just all be the racism or the inherent bias in what police and prosecutors do. And what most people are failing to grapple with is the story ends with us, right? The story begins when they're 3 and 4 and 5 years old. And the real tragedy from my perspective is that no one or very few people really want to think about that child until they turn into an adult, they commit a violent crime, and then they turn to police and prosecutors and they say, do something about that. And what I always try to remind people is, I'm like a trauma surgeon. When I get involved, when cops get involved, it's extremely expensive. The outcomes are not going to be good. And you're usually on the other side of a tragic event. And by the way, success for somebody like me in the traditional sense is someone ends up going to prison, and it costs the community $45,000 a year in my state to just put somebody in jail. That doesn't count the costs of prosecutors, police officers, probation officers, defense attorneys, judges, all the infrastructure of the criminal justice system. And what I try to challenge people with is, well, what if we took some of those resources and instead of spending $45,000 a year when someone has committed a violent event at 22, why don't we take $4,500 a year when they're 3 and 4 and 5 and redirect some of that upstream so that we can actually have prevention? But I don't think anyone should make any mistake about one very clear idea. I think that argument that came about a couple of years ago about defunding police, I think that was one of the dumbest things that we could have done as a community. As a member of the Democratic Party, people in my party were talking about that, advocating for that. I don't agree with that at all. I think what we need are better trained police officers and frankly, more police officers who have a role to play that is complemented by more specialists who are social workers or crisis intervention specialists or addiction specialists, right? We need to do sort of wraparound services upstream, but we have the resources in this country to do both. And it shouldn't be this thing where people try to subtract from what police officers have in terms of resources. They have an extremely difficult job. And unfortunately, from my perspective, what has happened is that we don't do enough to give them the right kind of training. And then we put them in situations where we ask them to do, they're a little bit like teachers, right? My mom is a teacher. We ask them to do everything, right? What do people do when they see something on the street that they don't know how to deal with, whether it's a psychiatric episode or something dealing with an addiction or a serious violent crime? All of those, well, let's call a cop, right? Let's call a cop. And we throw a lot of young people into a very stressful, tough, dynamic situation that they're just not prepared for. And what we have to start thinking about is how we can invest in all of the infrastructure and systems upstream so that we lower in total the number of people that the criminal justice system really needs to deal with. Because from my perspective, being the most accomplished prosecutor, right? You don't want to live in a city with the most experienced and most accomplished homicide prosecutor. You want to live in a city with no homicides, right? You want me to become like the Maytag man, right? The phone never rings. I just sit here. I'm rarely used. I'm rarely called. When you start reaching for a solution that requires police and prosecutors as the first response, you're already behind the curve. You have to start thinking upstream about all of those other inputs. And really, I have yet to encounter someone inside the criminal justice system who's committed an extraordinarily violent act or a dangerous act that didn't really come from an environment where it was somewhat predictable given the instability, the addiction, the violence that they've seen. When it comes to ACEs, what they've really started to see is how that rewires the brain. It rewires how people respond to stress, how they interpret the potential threats, their ability to form attachments. And they're doing a lot more research on how it impacts, how trauma can actually be passed down from one generation to the next. And I think as the science advances, what you're going to see is that trauma at a certain level becomes an inherited thing that really just passes from one generation to the next. And so if we're interested in justice, we have to break that cycle of early childhood trauma. And if we do that, if we start building up kids and lifting up communities at the base level, you're hopefully will live in an environment where police and prosecutors are something that they're always going to be necessary. We're always going to play an important role in the community, but it's not something that is the first response. It should be the last response.
By the time somebody encounters you, in your former role at least, it's just too late. It's too late. Yeah.
Yeah. The chances that we're gonna turn someone around, especially with prison and whatever meager sort of rehabilitation resources they have in prison is really low. Well, that was one of the things when I came out of law school. I thought that when I would get to a point where we secured a conviction and someone would go to prison, I would have this sense of justice. I take very seriously my ability to serve and help victims. And I've formed very close relationships with some of the victims and their families over the years. But it really is it's tragedy all the way around. You have lost, in the case of a murder, it's someone who's lost their life, a family who is shattered forever, and someone who's going to go to prison for the rest of their life. And there is not anyone that I've ever met as a prosecutor who said, well, thank God you're here. Most people who've interacted with me as the victim's family, they would give anything to have never met me in their life. And that true justice is let's start building a world where you never meet me. Because if you meet me either as a victim or as a defendant, you're living in a world of tragedy. And that's what we got to stop.
I was doing some research for an article I wrote a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, about prioritization and spending and how that is a manifestation of values in America. And when I looked up the education numbers, I was really shocked. It's like 15,000 per person per year, which is amazingly low. I don't know how much we're spending on law enforcement, but I have to imagine it's impossible to compare the two, but it was so low, and it's probably a major contributor to that cycle that you just described in these communities.
Well, it's a little bit like ignoring the advice of a doctor who says, exercise, eat your vegetables, have a low fat diet. And we don't want to do it. We don't want to do any of that. We're just like, all we want are heart surgeons. We kind of treat the criminal justice system the same way. We're just like more heart surgeons, and with an ounce of prevention, right? We could live in a very different world. And you're right. We have the resources. This is the richest nation in the history of the world. I live in a state that's still a relatively poor state. And even in this state, we had a surplus last year in large part because of oil and gas of nearly $4 billion. And yet we are 50th when it comes to child well-being. How is that possible? How is it possible that we have 1 in 5 children in my state living in poverty and we have $4 billion in excess money? It's from my perspective, we just have our priorities all wrong. And look, I get that there are broad philosophical debates about what kind of investments that we should have and what we should do with that money. But what especially for more conservative folks, what I always try to tell them is, look, you're going to pay for this one way or the other. So leave aside whether or not you think you have an obligation to help someone else's child or someone else's family. If you don't make that investment, it will come back to haunt you in the form of social costs, healthcare costs, poorly trained workforce, unsafe economic environments, right? You're going to pay for all of that anyway. It's a hidden tax. Instead of doing the math and just saying, look, an investment like this now on the front end in these kids, in particularly at the most and in the most at-risk children who are impacted by early childhood trauma, you would save massive amounts of money. I would imagine that if you looked at the data, you would see that the same kids that turn into adults that end up in the criminal justice system, they have a higher rate of truancy in schools, a higher rate of utilizing healthcare services, lower economic and obviously economic output. And you could totally change the dynamic of a community, leaving aside the ethical and sort of moral considerations, which I think are paramount. You can make a strong economic argument for shifting your focus upstream to the most at-risk community, at-risk children and at-risk families. And you make targeted interventions, you can save a lot of life, a lot of money, a lot of human potential, because that's what we should think about whenever we read a story that involves someone engaged in criminal activity, someone loses their life or ends up in prison. It's just a waste of human potential. And we do that each and every day in this country.
Yeah, all over the place. I know that you, as Attorney General, you have a busy schedule, and we only got about 15 minutes left. So maybe Why don't we do this? Because there's so many issues that I want to get your opinion on. Why don't we do a 15-minute hot take? We'll go issue by issue, because I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about criminal justice, and I wanted to, because I think you obviously have a wealth of experience, and it's a super important topic for this country. But there's a bunch of other ones too that you've been involved in. So one of the things that we've seen a lot in California is homelessness. What's going on with homelessness in New Mexico?
No, I think we're seeing some of the same things, that certainly not at the same scale. But I know the mayor here in Albuquerque and in Santa Fe, they're struggling with encampments, with how to get people into a safer environment. There's a lot of frustration on the part of property owners and business owners in the community with especially homeless encampments. I think, quite frankly, we are building and have finally started making important investments in shelters, transitional housing, rehabilitation, and support. But the bottom line is there are a lot of folks who are homeless who don't want to go into those spaces because they're addicted to drugs, and you can't use drugs in the shelter. And I would imagine that if you go in most of these places, drugs and addiction are at the center of a lot of what is the tension between being in a tent in an encampment somewhere and getting an offer of help. Now, there are communities that don't have an offer of help, and that's got to be the first thing. But let's assume we get to a place where we actually have resources to get people off the streets. The more critical decision is when we're going to start forcing people to avail themselves of those services, or whether we are comfortable just letting them live with their addiction and all that comes with that on the streets. I think most people are not comfortable with that. Even, I know they have a lot, hopefully people have a lot of sympathy for the dynamics that drive homelessness. But as a society, we've gotten to a place where we've, I think, gotten a little too complacent about allowing these things to metastasize in ways that are not good for people, obviously on the street, but not good for society as a whole.
I agree that the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of let's let people make choices. Well, sometimes, like you said, it's better for that individual for the state to make a decision. Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This episode of the Nick Halera Show is brought to you by Metros Capital. If you're an investor looking for direct access to real estate investments, then we'd love to talk with you. Investment opportunities at Metros Capital balance financial returns and community impact. To learn more, contact us at metros.nickhaleris.com. Again, that's metros.nickhaleris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. Here in California, the system is somewhat limited by some laws that were passed in the 60s that were a response to the old mental health regime, which was unfair and dangerous for other reasons, taking people's freedoms away. What is the landscape in New Mexico? Does the state have the ability to force people who are addicted to accept services and intervene in that way?
As the DA, we would often end up with people that were in the system over and over and over again. They would be apprehended for some, usually petty crime. They'd be brought into the system. They would be found incompetent but not dangerous, and then they would be returned back to the street because we couldn't prove dangerousness, and thereby get them held. That's a gap in the system that I think needs to be corrected. But I think more generally, we're going to be confronting what they're confronting, especially in states along the West Coast, which is, at what point are you going to enforce, for example, bans on camping in a community and in a city? And a lot of times there's this fallback position that there was a Ninth Circuit decision, I believe, that said you can't force people off the streets when you don't give them an alternative. But if you build capacity and you give them an alternative, then you do have the ability to enforce those kinds of camping bans. But it really comes down to what leaders in a community are willing to do. And I think what you're seeing is that pendulum swinging back, and especially Democratic leaders, Eric Adams, for example, and others, are starting to draw a harder line, as they should, in saying, no, you're part of a community. You live in a community, and you cannot just live this lifestyle and have those impacts really drag down the quality of life and the safety of everyone around you. And so my hope is that it'll start moving in that direction, but it's difficult because people find themselves caught politically between trying to be sympathetic and supportive, but also recognizing all the danger that's inherent in what that and what that life means.
The border and immigration. What's going on in the border in New Mexico?
You want a hot take on the border? Wow, man.
This is a tough one, but let's try to, let's talk about it for a few.
So number one, as a federal prosecutor on the border, I've handled more immigration cases than probably anybody you know. But what I can tell you is this. I think especially President Trump and others that sort of share his perspective on it have manipulated this issue and played games with this issue in a way that is not reflective of reality. It sort of exudes basic ignorance about economics. And it really tries to scapegoat people who, by and large, are trying to come to this country for the same reasons that almost all of our ancestors tried to come to this country, which is to improve their lot in life and have the freedom to achieve some form of prosperity and security that they can't find in their homeland. And I think it's an easy thing to do to scapegoat of people that don't have much of a voice and say, see, they are to blame for the economic woes and the problems that we have in this country. That said, I think there is a legitimate point to be made in the fact that we don't have a system that is adequately resourced in terms of coming up with a framework that is not chaos. Because right now it very much looks like chaos on the border. And in a lot of ways, if you're down there every day, it is unsustainable and untenable. And so for those of us who believe that immigration is a central cornerstone of what it means to live in this country, we have to maintain our ability to attract hardworking people from all over the world, talented people from all over the world. We have an obligation to come up with an orderly system. And it's the perfect example of how our political institutions are just locked in place. We have people on the far left and people on the far right who are not capable of getting to a sensible middle ground on what this would look like. And I think there's an opportunity for a compromise to be made that's going to require some accommodation that looks at, for example, giving a pathway for dreamers to have an opportunity for citizenship, to continue to be part of this community, to contribute to our community, but also to recognize that we can't continue to live in a place where we have unaccompanied minors that are frankly just encouraged to come over the border, in part because as a prosecutor, I'm very, very worried. The number of kids that are exploited because they're not protected, they come over the border, they end up in restaurants and hotels and agricultural industries. They're not going to school. They're getting taken advantage of. All of that human tragedy is a function of our dysfunction at the national level. And it really highlights the fact that we used to be able to solve big problems in this country, and our politics are so broken that we can't even have rational conversations to some of those issues until people grow up and stop playing political games with it, putting migrants on a bus or on a plane, making them promises, flying them to some blue state or blue city. And that's what children do. A toddler could come up with that kind of provocative stupidity. And it's inhumane. It's not, and it really, from my perspective, that's not who we are as Americans. We don't play games with people's lives like that. We shouldn't do that. And we shouldn't elevate people who are going to play games like that with someone's life. This is somebody's brother or sister or child who's getting put into a bus or put on a plane and dropped in the middle of nowhere because some guy who's trailing 30 points in the polls wants to be competitive in the Republican primary. When did we start doing that? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, well said. It's kind of a joke. It's a sad joke because there are actual human beings involved in it. But the fact that our politics has devolved to where that happens not just once, like that's happening on a regular basis.
And part of this, and I try to be look, I'm a Democrat, I'm an elected official, so I'm naturally in a position where I get pulled into politics a lot. But leaving that aside, I can't imagine George W. Bush, who I disagreed with on many things. He would never do that. Bob Dole would never do that. John McCain would never do that. They were decent human beings who understood that the role that they played in public leadership was bigger than scoring a political point at the expense of some desperate family. That's just not, it's not who we are. It's not what we should be doing. We've got these sort of entrenched positions in Congress, and they are unable to find a sensible middle way that I think most Americans could get behind if we could just have some adults in a room making rational choices and trade-offs.
Yeah. All right, guns and gun control. As a prosecutor, you've seen the bad side of a lot of gun violence. What's your take?
Well, look, I'm a gun owner. I grew up around guns. That said, I was a big advocate for universal background checks here in New Mexico. We passed universal background checks. We passed a red flag law to make sure that guns, to the extent that we can, are less accessible to people with mental health issues and criminal histories. And I think that's an important thing that we need to do. I think that there are types of weapons in this country that if there's not a ban in place, then there needs to be a lot more thorough sort of understanding about who these people are who think they need to have access to those weapons. I've been hunting for most of my life. I don't really see the need to have access to those weapons, but I know that the gun industry makes a lot of money off of that. That said, I think in my own situation as the DA, when I went to Santa Fe and advocated for universal background checks, I had a lot of people in my party who stood next to me and said, yes, gun violence, we absolutely have to take a stand. We absolutely have to do something about that. And they were on board when I was advocating for universal background checks. And then when I said, oh, by the way, our new bail reform laws have led to a situation where half of the felonies that are committed with a firearm in my community result in somebody being returned to the community, all of those same people left the debate. They were not willing to have a conversation about, well, maybe we should be detaining people who commit gun crimes. So it goes both ways. If we're going to have a meaningful conversation about guns, and we should put everything on the table, and that includes who has access to what kinds of weapons, and when you get caught with a gun, what is the systemic response? Or do we have sufficient penalties for people that access weapons? Do we hold and detain people who have violent criminal histories and are brandishing weapons and using weapons in our community? And I talk about bail reform and I bring up the gun thing, and the Republicans would say, yeah, we got to fix that. And the Democrats would be silent. And then when we talk about, hey, there's too much unregulated access to firearms, I'd have a bunch of Democrats saying, yeah, we got to do something about that. And then Republicans would be silent. And again, it's just an example of, right, if we're going to care about gun violence, we have to care about it everywhere all the time and start having, again, more rational conversations about how to solve the problem.
Yeah, it seems to be the consistent theme where you have these big issues, whether it's criminal justice or immigration and the border, and the inability of our leadership to have an intelligent dialogue means that these things just get kicked down the road to the next generation. And I sort of feel like maybe this is just our generation coming of age and coming to maturity, but I sort of feel like it's on us to correct that. And I know that you've dedicated your life to being a public servant, and I applaud you for that. And I'm proud to be your friend. And, you know, I feel like this is our time to step up like you and get involved in these kind of debates and try to bring it back to the middle so we could have like a reasonable conversation about it.
There's 2 points to that. Number one, we've forgotten a very basic and frankly essential component of our democratic system, of our Republican system of government. We have the option, because ultimately the people are in control or should be in control of the government, we have the option to reorganize the framework of government. And I think we would all be missing something if we just didn't fundamentally recognize that partisan gerrymandering that leads to these extreme outcomes is cancerous in this republic. It is cancerous because it leads to more extreme outcomes, and it doesn't provide a meaningful space for people in the middle to find some common ground. I think the judiciary has aided in that, in shirking its responsibility to look at our constitutional structure and say there are deep flaws in how we do things, that you would allow and encourage legislators to draw their own lines and then cement their own partisan power by these bizarre congressional districts that leave people in a 50-50 state with sort of a congressional balance that's 70-30. We should break those things down. But the other component that's layered on top of that is something that I am keenly aware of, and I try to get people to pay attention to it more, and that is the role that the media has played and also technology has played. I tell people all the time that I think the phone is one of the most, the modern smartphone is potentially one of the most dangerous products that human beings have handed out en masse to almost every person on this planet, at least in the developed countries, with little or no understanding of how information is distributed, the financial and economic incentives that are behind social media platforms and their need for engagement, which means pushing content that is highly inflammatory because that's what drives engagement, how it allows for distortions in basic information. And what happens is we all, to one extent or another, are starting to live in these siloed worlds where you only hear from people who agree with you and filter out everything else. And then inside that echo chamber, the most extreme voices are pushed to the top of your feed. They're pushed to the forefront of everything that you see. And then pretty soon you have a very distorted view of your friends or neighbors or fellow citizens, and you're not in a place where you think we can actually find common ground. And you just look at the data now, one of the biggest dividing lines in families, it's not race, it's not ethnicity. It's, is my son or daughter going to bring home somebody from the opposite party? That's the most appalling thing for Americans. That's nuts. That's nuts. But it's a function of turning on the television and watching somebody on cable news blast the other side, not just as a group of people that we disagree with, but they're fundamentally immoral or they're fundamentally at odds with our basic values. And I don't think that's true. I just think people are being manipulated in how they receive and consume information. And, my grandparents were raising their children. Walter Cronkite would get on the news every night. He would give you what the basic facts and information were. And then based on those facts and information, the political community could come to some sort of consensus about what needed to be done. We don't have that. And if you don't have shared facts, there's literally in a democratic society, nothing you can achieve. And so we had better wake up to the startling reality that what we are being force-fed on a daily basis by people who have an economic interest in selling us things and keeping us engaged is not healthy for democracy. It's not healthy for a republic. And if we don't address that and deal with it, we're going to have a hard time holding this country together, because the United States are not like other countries that are grounded in this unique ethnic identity or religious identity. By our nature, we are or supposed to be a melting pot of peoples from all over the world with different religious perspectives and philosophies, or none, different ethnic and racial identities that we bring to the table. So the glue that's supposed to hold us together is this shared commitment to democratic self-government and equal justice and equal opportunity. But that all underlying all of that has to be a shared understanding of basic facts. And if you don't have a shared understanding of basic facts, that's how you end up in a situation where you can live in the same town, but the people next to you live on a different planet. And that's a challenge that our generation is going to have to face, while we also try to redesign a constitutional structure for sort of modern times.
Man, that was well said, and it may be a good way to bring this to a close. I think, just to add on to that, I think Americans they really underestimate how important this country is to history and democratic freedom. If there's no America, what does the world look like? That's a scary proposition. There's a huge percentage of this world right now that is living under tyrannical or quasi-tyrannical regimes. And it looks like nothing when you live here, but go live over there. Go have a minority position or be a minority in one of those places, or happen to be on the wrong side of politics in one of those places. It's really a problem. And so America, not only do we have to fix it for our own prosperity, but for the future. If there's no America, then the world looks pretty dark.
No, that's exactly, you know what it is, man. It's not just the world now. If you look at the long sweep of human history, the default setting is a strongman. The default setting is a king, a czar, an emperor, no dissent, right? This top-down authoritarian view of the world. I think Americans lose sight of and fail to appreciate what a fleeting and unique gift it is that we've inherited, right? We literally have inherited. And that's when you go back and you think about great presidential speeches. And then the one I think a lot of people always refer to is when Kennedy starts talking about the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. What he's talking about is our commitment to maintaining what we've been given as a gift and passing it forward. And if we're not careful, we're in danger of failing to pass that generational gift onto our kids and our grandkids. And we can't be complacent about it. We cannot just sit back and wait for someone else to get engaged and someone else to get involved. We have to accept ownership over what it really means and recognize that whatever our differences are, our shared commitment to the ability to govern ourselves as a free people has to take precedence over everything else.
Beautiful. Well, appreciate your time, man. Thank you.
Yeah. Good to see you, bud.
This is a super fun conversation. And I'll put some links so that listeners can follow your important work as the Attorney General of New Mexico.
You bet. You take care.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to The Nick Halera Show. We hope you enjoyed the episode and would appreciate your help with spreading the word by sharing with your network on social. And until next time, remember, it's not about pursuing success to unlock fulfillment. It's about learning how to find fulfillment in the midst of success.